Here I want to give you an intention training technique. I didn't write this out. Well, I do have it written out elsewhere, but I'm not going to read it. I'm just going to wing it. Some years ago when I developed a personal peak achievement or maximum performance training program, this technique was included. Now that program was a program of systematic work in the use of techniques for energy control at various levels. I used the acronym POWER ACT to describe the 8 areas that would be addressed in this overall program. POWER ACT stood for certain areas of physical control, that being P, physical, such as control of brainwave activity, the integration of left and right brain thinking, and other forms of physical energy control. The O stood for observation, that is the development of our power of observation to more accurately perceive the world. The W, I have to pay attention to my cat here trying to wreck my house. The W stood for willpower, stands for willpower, the development of the use of power of will to achieve all these other ends. The E stood for emotion, that implying emotional control techniques, such as the mood of calm confidence, which I have posted here in a video called Calm Attention Technique and the Mood of Calm Confidence. Have a look at it. R in the word POWER ACT stands for rationality. So my comprehensive training program included some tools for the development of thought along more rational lines than may be currently employed by somebody. So we first sense material from the outside world, and it's important to more accurately perceive it than the level of accuracy at which it is currently perceived. Any of these things can be improved upon, no matter what your starting point is. So it's a good idea, to, with respect to rationality, have accurate information to deal with in the first place, and then cognize it in a rational manner. So rationality, that's the word power, and then act. Act. The A stands for atmosphere, that meaning personal atmosphere. That refers to our interface with other people, how we interface with them. Something that a lot of people can improve at, including myself. The C stood for creativity or creative thinking. My program involved basic fundamental principles of creative thinking and how to apply them to the further development of creativity, creative thinking. And finally, the T stood for thought control, which largely implies, 3 things: attention, concentration, and thought content. Attention actually is vital to all of the other 7 areas. So practice with any of these other things involves some level of gaining control over attention if any of these things are done correctly or in accordance with the instructions. If done properly, they will help to train your attention to focus. But then there is attention training in and of itself. And attention is the ability to focus mentally, not on any specific thing. It's just a principle. It's a mental faculty. Now, when applied to some specific object of attention, to a high level of proficiency, it's called concentration. So attention is the mental faculty involved with concentration. And there are ways to develop it that are indirect, that is, by using attention control to do certain things, or focusing in on specific things. But then there is attention control development that stands by itself, or more by itself. And I'm going to give one such method here, one such technique here. And by the way, my overall training program then went from focusing on those 8 areas for what I was calling maximum performance or peak achievement, and I blended into it other things such as other things that had to do with what I was then calling personal evolution. So the Power Act areas of emphasis were then added to, and the whole thing became quite comprehensive and overwhelming for people who I had as clients. And as I've stated elsewhere here in my channel, nobody really made it through the whole way. They kind of stopped somewhere along the way. And if I were to have charged money, it would have been a lot of money, because the whole program would take about 1.5 years. And believe me, it does take quite a bit of time, dedication, earnestness, and perseverance to really evolve intentionally and effectively and efficiently. It takes attention. It takes perseverance. It's hard work. This is why many people don't engage in it to any great extent. For most people, it's kind of strange stuff to do anyway, because it's not part of one's focus every day in just, people's normal everyday activities. It's an area of its own. And of course, if done properly, any proper program for such a thing will include implementation into everyday life activities. If it has you off in a mountain somewhere, sitting in a lotus position in a cave, that's an extreme example of what I'm trying to get at here. But if it doesn't involve implementation into your daily activities, then it's something off in some other area. I don't know. But a lot of such material is always embedded in some kind of a spiritual path. And then that becomes another reason why some people just don't get involved with it very much. Because as soon as they see that it's involved in some spiritual path, they might, red flags might go up, such as, well, this isn't my spiritual path, that's somebody else's. Or, well, that's New Age material, and I don't trust that. So my stuff doesn't have to do with any spiritual path, really. If it wants to be applied to a spiritual path, or you want to see it as a spiritual path of its own, fine. Go ahead. It's not inconsistent with any spiritual path. So anyway, pulling out of context from my training program, in the attention or thought control area, I'm going to just pull out of context, an attention training technique. Now, in my training program, this attention training technique did not come first. There are prerequisites to it. There's a logical sequence to do things in. Now, any kind of program that involves various phases and steps and techniques combined together into, more meta techniques and so forth, and ultimately into some kind of a way of being, there's a logical sequence to follow. And that logical sequence isn't usually carved in stone for any one particular path, so to speak. I mean, there can be variations. But we can't, when laying out such a program, we can't give all the possible variations. They can become endless. And then which variation to apply to which personality type or whatever. That's too complicated. So a lot of people then hesitate to follow any particular one because they think, well, that might be the sequence or the way for it to go for somebody else, but maybe not for me. And then again, some people say, well, I'm not going to lay out a formula because it has, yeah, you have to come up with your own. But then that leaves the person who's actually looking for something like a formula wondering, well, okay, but I don't know how to put one together for myself. I don't know. I don't know the tools. So help, please help. I'll follow a formula, and once I get familiar with it and how it works, maybe then I can make up my own. But give me something to start with. Don't just tell me what the goal should be and then let me hanging. Well, I'm pulling out of context here a technique. It's pretty simple to say, to tell you how to do it, but it's pretty hard to achieve. It's pretty hard to do, and it's pretty hard to achieve the result. But the result has wide scope and extreme fruitfulness when it comes to control over your attention. But like I say, I'm pulling it out of context. There are things that should become prerequisite to it, but I can't just sit here and make a video of a whole program of training. Like I said elsewhere here in my channel, that could just go on forever. It would be a very long video. So I have to give it in little bits and pieces. And you have to trust, okay, that there may have been some things to do in preparation for a technique like this one that will make it easier to do and have more efficient results for you. Yeah. But I'm having to pull things out and just give them to you in little bits and pieces. So this is a bit, this is a bit, this is a piece. And trust that it will, while it might be a little bit more difficult to do without some prerequisite material, you'll get it. Just work with it. Keep it up. And the results will be pretty good. Pretty good. I will say right here that if you want to do something prerequisite to it, go to my video. I forget the full name of it, but it has to do with, in the title, in the name of the video, are the words motives and goals. Look for that and do that first. Do that first. If you do that, you will gain some greater control over your attention, along with accomplishing a lot of other stuff. Then, if you get it done, if you get through that one's pretty good. That one's a doozy to get done, to get through, but it does have an end. And then there are suggestions for its daily application. Once you get the whole, just have a look at it. It's kind of hard to describe something to you if you don't know what it is I'm referring to. But have a look at it. You get that done, get the whole thing done, right? And then you're just ready to use it every day. One of its uses will be to go through the little daily thing to do with it. Then once you have it set up, the thing that I propose in it set up, then do the 2 or 3 minute thing that is to be done with them every day that I give you in there, and then go into this attention training exercise. And then there will be things to do right after that, as a morning and evening practice, let's say. There will be some things to do with it. And I want you to bear in mind, one of those things to do after it is some kind of a relaxation or energy revitalization method, which I'm going to give somewhere else. Like I said, bits and pieces. But direct training with attention training in itself, some isolated technique that's for that purpose, with that being the main purpose, does take a bit of energy. And it is a pretty good idea to have at least some kind of relaxation method or technique that you can apply for a minute or two after doing your attention training technique that I'm going to give you, or some kind of energy revitalization, some breathing, let's say, full breaths, with the idea that you are bringing in fresh prana to replace any that has been used. Because attention training does take some energy. Make sure you do something to just replace it, to balance that out. Balance out the energy put into what you just did with an attention training technique. Now here's the technique in itself. The instruction is to focus your gaze, your visual gaze, your eyes. Just place your gaze upon some spot. That's the statement that I'm giving you in the instruction. But I'm going to tell you how to do that. What kind of a spot? Upon some spot. Well, that could mean anything, right? Just some place, some location on a wall or whatever. But no, I want you to create a spot. Get out a piece of white paper and place a quarter on it in the center, on the center of the page, on the center of the paper. Draw a black circle around it. Then remove the quarter and fill in the circle with black ink. Make a spot. That'll be your spot. A black spot against a white blank background. Then take that piece of paper and tape it or glue it or otherwise fasten it to something rigid like the cardboard on the underside of a tablet so that you can stand this paper upright or thumbtack it to a wall and the edges won't curl down, the upward edges won't, corners won't curl downward. Just something to hold it rigid so that you can place it before you at a distance of about 3 feet, 2 to 3 feet, so that it pretty much fills your immediate visual range. And you're not too far from it so that you have, a lot of other background involved. We want pretty much just the white background, but not up so close also that it's completely filling your visible range, immediate visual range. 2 or 3 feet away. And fix your gaze upon it, your physical gaze, your your eyes. Now that's the end of that part. The spot is not important. It's just a place to fix your gaze with your eyes open while you do the technique, while you perform the technique of attention training. The spot is of no great importance. Like I say, it's just a place to fix your gaze. For this technique, for this mental training technique here, attention training technique, we want our eyes open because it's going to be applied to everyday life with our eyes open. So we don't want to practice this with our eyes closed. We want our eyes open. But we don't want your, a lot of distraction to be involved or a variety of objects to be in your visible, your scope of visual awareness while we're doing this technique. So that's why it's a black spot on a white background with your peripheral vision being able to see other stuff. So this is a way to keep your eyes open, focused on, something that's not all that interesting, with the least bit of visual distraction surrounding it, and yet you can see the world around it, peripherally. So and that's the end of that part. It's not the real technique. The real technique, with your eyes fixed on some spot, is to mentally count from 0 to 100, starting with 1. That seems pretty simple, and it is. But that's not the end of it. How fast to count mentally? Everybody has kind of a normal pulse or beat, rhythm for mentally counting. So if your mental count rate is 1, 2, 3, 4, that's a little faster than most people's. But if that's it, if that's where you kind of naturally fall in with, that frequency, that rate of speed, then that's what you do. If it's 1, 2, 3, Then follow that. Most people's is somewhere in between those two, kind of corresponding to their heartbeat, the rate of their pulse, but not necessarily so. It's just similar to that. Most people's is about 1, 2, 3, 4, something like that, kind of like the seconds passing. And that's the rate to go at. Don't speed up or slow down. When you find your rate, you stick with it. Don't go, speeding up and slowing down like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. No, stick with the same rate. Make it rhythmic. But now the goal is to not just count. And counting isn't really important either, although it's more important than that spot you're looking at. The goal is to progress in a monotonous, linear progression. Progression and progression. That's a little redundant, isn't it? To engage in a monotonous, linear progression of thought with full attention and with no other thought than it. The goal is to make it to 100 with absolutely no intruding thought. That's the hard part. The reason why it's something monotonous, like just counting, is because it really requires a lot of attention to do it. And there's not any real distracting content in the thought of numbers. So there's not distraction in it. I mean, we're not naming colors, and then we have to battle the idea of different colors and then different things that might have those colors that we know of in our lives, and a lot of tendency for the mind to go wandering off somewhere else because of the content of our attention training technique. We want to avoid that. And we want it to be kind of monotonous because something just boring and kind of void of content that's, it's not related to much else. It's just numbers. So that it really requires attention to be able to do it. It's very effective this way. So that's why we choose numbers, counting, in a sequence, linear progression. A linear progression helps us to, it's a tool, it's an object of attention that facilitates or instruments finally honing our attention. Because it's a progression, a linear progression. It allows us, as it's going, right? Here's the linear progression. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's like a straight line. And it allows us, it's a line along which we can continually focus, refine our attention into it as we go, rather than being something that jumps from here to there and so forth by way of its content. So it's linear, it's monotonous, and it doesn't involve anything really other than just what it is in itself. So now you know why the spot, why to fix your gaze on it, why we're counting. Knowing why this works and how it works and the reasons for it to be the way it is good information. It's all part of it. I'm not just giving you a set of instructions here and saying do it and not telling you why. Full, complete instruction. Now go about this with the intention to improve your control over your attention. Intend that to be the result. And I'm going to give you more clues to how to do this. And I want you to apply every bit of this knowledge to doing it. Which becomes a little tricky. You go about it with awareness of why you're doing it and how you're doing it. And if you have done your motive and goal work that I have already given here and that I've suggested that you do as a prerequisite to this, go about it while starting into it, recalling a strong motive for doing it. And being aware of your motives in the first place for any kind of personal growth or, for achievement in your life will help you do this every day, because it is strange to do it first. It does require perseverance. And if you're not clear on your motives for getting it, for doing it, for achieving the goals that it will lead to, you might give it up. Motives create interest. And without interest, you really can't place your attention on persevering through something. But this requires perseverance. It just so happens that this is attention training. So the more you do it, the better you will be able to attend to doing it. This is one of nature's ways of getting many things done at one time. Here's what to do. Here's the secret behind success with it. Another secret behind success with it. You see, a lot of people might not do this. They might not even do this one time because they think I have pretty good control over my attention and I don't need any greater control. I don't even want greater control. But if their reason is, I already have pretty good control over my attention, well, we'll see. Many people who do it one or two times will get to 100 and think, well, that wasn't hard. I must have perfect concentration because I had no intruding thoughts. Some people will think that. And then the third or fourth or fifth time they do it, they start to notice that they had intruding thoughts, and they did the first time too. They just didn't know what an intruding thought was like. They were that bad at attention control. And there they'd been going along thinking they had great control, even though they did this one time or two times. It just took them a little while to get the idea, to understand that they didn't have very good attention control. They didn't even know what an intruding thought was. They thought all their mental clatter was great concentration. But at some point, whether it's the first time they're doing this or not, a person becomes the first phase of this happening is becoming aware that we're having difficulty focusing. The second phase is becoming aware of just how many intruding thoughts there are going on in our minds almost all the time. How many different thoughts are going on at once? And then any time we think that we're focusing on just one, we're not. We might have one main thought on the front burner for a brief period, but then something else takes over. And our attention gets shifted to something else, and many people think, well, I did that on purpose, when in fact they didn't. They're just so used to that happening. Their attention getting hijacked from one thing to another, they get this idea that they're in charge of it all. They're in charge of it all. Well, an exercise like this, a technique like this should soon show a person that that's not always the case, that they're not really in that great control. In other words, this exercise will increasingly show, as one of its early phases of awareness about how this is going, that the mind is full of clutter. And that attention is pretty much being hijacked almost all the time. Whether it's background thoughts coming in, or our main focus being shifted here and there, quite rapidly at times. I mean, how many times are you at work doing something with your hands, let's say, and your mind is somewhere else, going from one thought to another? And somebody comes up and asks you, what have you been focusing on here? And you say, what I'm doing with my hands. There's a pretty good example of what I'm talking about. There's no reason to be focusing on something other than what you're doing. There was a time to focus one's attention on other things. Things that have happened in the past, things that are happening somewhere else, or things that might happen in the future. There is a time for it. And that time is not while you're doing something with your hands. If you're doing something with your hands, especially something that has to do with how you're making a living, and your mind is on something else, something that somebody said to you, what your response should have been, what you would like to have said if you'd had been in your, on your toes, so to speak, or planning for a vacation, or any other thing, then you're neither attending to it very well or what you're doing with your hands. Your attention is split. And there may be moments during such physical activity about which if you look back on them a minute later, you will realize that you can barely remember that 5-second period, some 5-second period just a minute ago with respect to what you were doing with your hands because your mind was elsewhere. So at some early point in performing this technique of what I call spot counting, you become more aware of what an intruding thought feels like, or what it looks like, what it is, and just how many of them there are. And about the time that happens, about the time that realization comes thundering in on a person, they will realize that they can barely make it to about the number 3 or 4 without some intruding thought getting in the way. That thought might be, hey, I'm counting. Or, am I doing this right? Or, I'm looking at a spot. Or, drift off to the sound of some car passing by the window. Or, well, there's an infinite variety of things that could come in. Like, this is boring. Or, I can do this really well. Or, I suck at this. Whatever. Now, upon realizing that all of these thoughts are intrusions, because they're not part of the instructions, thinking about them, having them come into your mind and getting your attention, passing through, being noticed by you, being in there in the mental atmosphere of this technique is not part of the instructions. Shortly after that, become aware of just how many levels of these things there are. There are major ones slipping in, and then there are lesser ones slipping in, and then there are lesser ones slipping in, and lesser, and lesser. You realize at some point that even by the time you got to the number 2, there were a whole bunch of little tiny ones, the level of occurrence of which you never knew existed in your mind. And every time you peel off or get through or make a breakthrough in no longer being distracted by a level of this kind of mental activity, the next level down seems to come up and be the next level in line for you to have to, get through and peel away and get better with by honing your attentive ability through this technique. At last, there will come a time, provided that you can follow these instructions and that you do not have the plague of some severe mental illness, or you are not addicted to some heavy drugs. There will come the time, if you persevere and do this as instructed, there will come a time when you will get to 100 with no intruding thought other than the activity at hand. You do it by not focusing on any intruding thought, but by just easily bringing your attention back to counting. Now, you don't have to go back and re-say a number to yourself if you got lost, to any little extent or great extent at all. If you got lost just a little, or if you got lost a lot, all of a sudden, doesn't matter. Just keep counting. Bring your attention back to what you're doing. Now, at first, you will wonder, at some point, you will probably wonder to yourself, do I have to, mentally picture the number? Or is this just saying it to myself? Or is even saying it to myself a distraction? Is there something deeper about just counting that doesn't even involve an intruding thought like seeing the number in my head? Is that part of the counting? Or is that a separate thought that doesn't really belong? What is the core of counting that I should be focusing on? In other words, are there aspects of the counting that are not representative of full attention on just counting? Is it just the experience of counting? Do you get the nature of the question I'm getting at here that might arise in your mind at some point? The answer is, if mentally picturing the number is a useful tool for a while, use it. If saying it loudly to yourself makes it easier to continue on without other thoughts that aren't related to counting coming in, then do that. As a matter of fact, it's a later exercise to learn to say things loudly in your head and then things quietly in your head, and then have thoughts with no sound attached to them at all. These are all forms of mental control that can be used for other things, just beyond the faculty implied on its own. But eventually, whenever you have become really good at counting out any thought that has nothing to do with counting, then you will be able to answer for yourself what really just true, centered, honed, finally controlled attention on counting a linear sequence of numbers is. You will have the choice then, and the kind of control that would be required to either do it with a mental image of the number or without, and pick and choose which the way you want to do it. The more you come to just the pure experience of counting, which can only be described as that, the more you'll understand how to get control over it. You'll just naturally fall into step with that. But usually there's going to be an accompanying mental image, an accompanying sound of the number in your head. What else is counting comprised of? It does include those things. But there are different levels of its purity, let's say. All right. You now know where to be fixing your gaze while you do this. And then not be distracted by what you're looking at visually. You know now what to do mentally and how to accomplish it. Just keep honing your focus, honing your focus, honing your focus. And you will learn that mental attention does not have anything to do directly, no direct thing to do with where you're placing your eyes, what you're looking at. Some people, if you say focus on something, they look at something. And then their mind might go somewhere else, but they'll swear to goodness, that they're focused on something because their eyes are looking at it, no matter what their mind is doing. No, we're talking about kind of like the opposite of that. That it doesn't matter what your eyes are looking at. We're talking about mental focus. And this is a technique that is very powerful in gaining great control over mental focus. And because of the linear and monotonous and kind of like pure nature of just this counting, the mental focus that will come from this, the attention control that will come from this, is so, it's rooted in something that is just a linear progression of numbers. Therefore, it wasn't really associated with any specific thing other than just a linear progression of cognition. That means that it is applicable across the board of daily activity. And it will come into play just naturally, because this is a mental faculty being developed in itself, not with respect to some specific kind of daily activity. It will be applied, it will come in naturally in everything that you do that you focus on. Your focus will be better. And you can intentionally be aware of attention as you go about daily activities, and thereby increase your focus on top of just the natural result of having performed this technique every day. Now, don't do this more than twice a day. This technique, don't do it more than twice a day. Don't. Because you can burn yourself out, and it does take some energy to do it. Also, get to 100 every time you do it. And like I said, don't go back and restate a number if you got distracted during it. Just keep going. Having simply and easily brought your attention back to what you're doing. And always do this, pushing your attention capability as far as you can, to its limit. Always go at it in the same way that you improve at doing anything else if you're improving at doing it with maximum efficiency. Let me give you an example. Learning to play the guitar, let's say. If you can imagine this, you're learning to play the piano or the guitar, and you only go at it half-mindedly, and every day that you practice, you don't push yourself beyond where you were last time. Well, you're never going to get much better. You really have to be putting your mind into it, right? And you have to take into account the fact that your technique with playing the piano or the guitar, your skill with it, is not improving when you're not playing. It's only improving when you are playing, except for the mental incubation that's going on behind the scenes when you're not playing. I'm not referring to that. I'm referring to the results that occur when you're playing. Those kinds of results don't occur when you're not. So, there's actually a little slipping backwards when you're not playing. Let's say you practice for an hour a day, that's 23 hours a day that you're not practicing, you're losing some skill. So it takes a little while when you pick up practicing the next day to get back to the point where you left off the day before. And then you practice beyond that. You always have to practice beyond getting yourself back to, that we call it warming up. Beyond warming up. And while warming up and then going past warming up into progress, we have to place our full attention on it. And the more we do that, the more efficient will be our progress. So if we go about an attention training technique with attention to it, and always pushing that attention to its furthest limit so that we're always getting better at it, not just letting it up to repetition to make us better at it, but intentionally becoming better at it by applying all the attention training and the effectiveness and the result of all the former attention training we've done with the same technique to every time we do it. Then we'll have some effective and efficient progress. Go at it like that. One more thing. After you're having thought of a motive for doing it, or having gone through your whole motives exercise that I've laid out somewhere else here, I've already mentioned that, start with that. And then interface from having a motive in mind into the attention to the spot counting technique. Interface those with attention on the following phrase, saying it loudly in your head, slowly, and thinking of the meaning of each word to the point of feeling it. This is important. Thinking of the meaning of each word to the point of feeling it. This phrase, I will to gain strong willpower. Exactly that phrase. Think of the meaning of each word to the point of feeling it. I will to gain strong willpower. That does several things at one time. If you're thinking of the meaning of each word to the point of feeling it, you will eventually realize that this is doing several things at one time. And then place your focus on the technique, the spot counting technique, and do it. Twice a day, no more than that. You can do it just once a day, but don't do it more than twice a day. And then follow it with something like some breathing, with your intention to replace the energy that you just used. And don't stop doing this exercise every day. At least once, no more than twice. Until you have achieved the desired result. And don't stop then either. Just keep doing it so you don't lose it. Of course, in my comprehensive training program, new things for attention training are added in about the 21st day of having practiced this one. And eventually this one gets dropped off in favor of more evolved techniques, to which this one serves as a prerequisite. And like I said, there are prerequisites to this, and you already have a few of them here. If you have the mood of calm confidence at your hand, invoke that before going into this attention technique. Also, in addition to what I've laid out here. But always follow it then with something that replaces your energy. All right, that's it. Spot counting. Powerful thing, man. If you do it right. There we go.